own apartment building. Her ex-boyfriend now in custody for the crime, and her loved ones are trying to raise awareness of the impact of domestic violence. Eyewitness News reporter Sonia Rincon with a story from their vigil earlier tonight.
She had moved on, a mom of 4 whose world was built around her children, a routine, a life that no longer included him. And for a while, that should have been enough. But in the early hours of a quiet morning in Harlem, something didn't feel right inside that building. A neighbor passed by a masked man in the hallway and kept walking. Another heard screams and didn't think much of it. Minutes later, a porter made his rounds, and what he found changed everything. Just outside her own door, a mother of 4 lay there, never making it inside. The man responsible didn't run. He walked out, calm, mask still on, and hours later he showed up at a hospital in the Bronx. But what authorities uncovered next told a story he couldn't explain. A story that began long before that hallway and ended in a way no one saw coming. And what makes it worse, because this wasn't random, this wasn't a stranger. This was someone who had been waiting for her for hours. But the question is, why? Before we get into this, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Stories Chronicles and comment where you're watching from around the world. Carmen Lopez lived a life that, to most people around her, felt steady. At 47 years old, she was a mother of 4. Her world built around her children, their needs, their routines, and the quiet responsibilities that come with holding a family together. She wasn't someone chasing attention or drama. She moved through life with a sense of order, the kind that comes from years of putting others first. Her days followed a rhythm. Wake up, check in on her kids, make sure everyone was where they needed to be, handle what needed to be handled. And when the day finally slowed down, she returned to the one place that mattered most, home. That apartment in Harlem wasn't just a place to sleep. It was where birthdays were celebrated, where conversations stretched late into the night, where her children could feel safe. Inside those walls, Carmen was more than just a mother. She was the center of everything. The one who kept things running, even when life got difficult. People who knew her didn't describe her as loud or outgoing. They described her as reliable, the kind of person who showed up, the kind of person who didn't create problems. And maybe that's why nothing about her life suggested danger. She wasn't involved in anything risky. She wasn't surrounded by chaos. She wasn't living recklessly. She was living normally. Which makes what happened to her even harder to process. Because when something violent happens, people often look for signs, something that explains it, something that makes it make sense. But with Carmen, there wasn't anything obvious. Just a woman raising her children. Just a routine life inside a familiar building. Just another night that should have ended like every other one. And yet, behind that normal life, there were parts of her story that didn't fully show on the surface. Parts that hadn't yet reached a breaking point. A neighbor would later describe her in the simplest way possible. She never caused trouble, always kept to herself. There was no hesitation in those words. No confusion, just certainty. Carmen wasn't someone people worried about. She wasn't someone you would expect to be at the center of something like this. Which leaves a question that doesn't go away. If her life was so normal, how did it end in something this violent? Luis Marquez was not a stranger to Carmen Lopez. He was someone who had been part of her life for years. Their relationship stretched over roughly 5 years, on and off, never fully stable, never completely finished. There were periods where things seemed calm, even normal. Then there were times when distance grew, when they separated, when it looked like it was finally over. But it never stayed over. They kept finding their way back into each other's lives. To people on the outside, it may have looked like a complicated but familiar kind of relationship. The kind where history keeps pulling 2 people back together. The kind where feelings don't disappear, even when things stop working. But underneath that pattern, something else was forming. Luis wasn't just attached to Carmen. He depended on her in a way that went deeper than a typical relationship. Reports later revealed that he saw her as his entire life. Not a part of it. Not someone important. Everything. And that kind of attachment can shift the balance of a relationship without anyone realizing it at first. Because when one person becomes your entire world, losing them doesn't feel like heartbreak. It feels like losing control. and that's where things begin to change. At some point, Carmen moved forward. The relationship, at least from her side, had ended. She was no longer trying to rebuild what had already broken down. But for Luis, that ending didn't register the same way. There were signs, subtle, easy to dismiss at first. Jealousy that didn't fade after arguments, a need to know where she was, who she was with, an emotional pull that didn't loosen, even when the relationship itself had. It wasn't explosive, not in the beginning. It showed up in smaller ways. In conversations that didn't quite feel right. In reactions that felt heavier than they should have been. A conversation where Carmen tried to create distance, and Luis pushed back. Not necessarily with violence, but with intensity. With the kind of persistence that makes it hard to fully walk away. Because every time she tried to step back, he was still there. Still holding on. Still connected. Which leads to a question that becomes impossible to ignore. What changed that made him go from attached to dangerous? At some point, the relationship reached a place it had been heading toward for a long time. Carmen moved on. Not dramatically, not with a public fallout, just a quiet decision that the cycle had to end. After years of going back and forth, something shifted for her. The connection that once pulled her back no longer had the same hold. She created distance. And this time, it wasn't temporary. That kind of change doesn't always come with a clear announcement. It shows up in smaller ways, less communication, fewer responses, a different tone. A shift in energy that says, without saying it directly, this is over. For Carmen, it was a step forward. For Luis, it was something else entirely. There's a difference between someone missing you and someone refusing to let go. And Luis fell into the second category. He didn't just struggle with the breakup, he rejected it. The separation didn't feel real to him. It felt like something that could still be reversed, fixed, pulled back into place. That mindset creates pressure. And pressure builds behavior. There were signs, again, not explosive, but persistent. He would show up, not necessarily invited, not always expected, just present. Moments where Carmen might have noticed him appearing where he didn't need to be. Moments that could easily be brushed off at first. Because when you know someone, when you've shared years with them, it's hard to immediately see their behavior as a threat. But repetition changes that. What starts as coincidence starts to feel intentional. What feels intentional starts to feel uncomfortable, and what feels uncomfortable starts to feel wrong. There was also the need to know where she was, what she was doing, who she was around. Not always asked directly, but understood. That kind of attention doesn't come from curiosity, it comes from attachment that hasn't been released. And over time, that attachment began to show signs of instability. Emotionally, Luis wasn't where Carmen was. She had moved forward. He hadn't. And that gap between acceptance and refusal creates tension that doesn't resolve on its own. It builds. There's a pattern that shows up in situations like this, one that often goes unnoticed until it's too late. When a relationship ends, the level of risk doesn't always decrease. In many cases, it increases. Because the breakup removes something important: control. For someone who is deeply attached, losing that control can trigger behavior that wasn't visible before. The structure they relied on is gone. The access they had is gone. And in its place is uncertainty, frustration, and sometimes anger. That doesn't mean every breakup becomes dangerous. But when you combine emotional dependency, rejection, and an inability to let go, the situation begins to change. What once looked like a complicated relationship starts to take on a different tone. One that isn't just emotional anymore. That night began like any other. Carmen stepped out, spending a few hours away from home. Nothing unusual, no sign that anything was wrong, just time outside, the kind of ordinary routine that had been part of her life for years. She had no reason to rush back, no reason to feel watched, no reason to believe that anything was waiting for her. While she was out, her apartment building stood the same way it always did, quiet, still, familiar. But inside that building, something had already changed. Luis Marquez had entered. Not by chance, not passing through. He came with purpose. Instead of going to her door, instead of knocking, instead of leaving when she wasn't there, he stayed. He moved into the stairwell area, out of direct view, where he could remain unnoticed. It wasn't a place people lingered. It wasn't a place you would expect someone to wait, but that's exactly what he did. And then the waiting began. Minutes passed, then more. The kind of time that stretches when nothing is happening, when every second feels longer than it should. The building remained quiet, doors closed, lights steady, no one moving in the hallway. And still, he stayed there. He didn't leave. He didn't walk away. He didn't change his mind. He waited. An hour passed, then another. Over 2 hours. That detail stands out because it changes how everything is understood. This wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't a moment of anger that appeared out of nowhere. This was time. Time to think. Time to reconsider. Time to walk away. But none of those things happened. He stayed in that same position, holding on to whatever thought had brought him there in the first place. The longer the time passed, the clearer it became. This wasn't hesitation. It was commitment. Outside, Carmen was still going about her night, unaware. Unaware that someone who once knew her routine, her building, her life, was now inside, waiting. There were no warnings, no messages, no confrontation beforehand, just silence. It's just after 4 a.m. when Carmen Lopez steps into her building. The entrance is still, nothing out of place, no movement, no voices, just the quiet familiarity of a place she knows well. She walks toward the elevator, presses the button, and waits. A few seconds later, the doors open. She steps inside. Then the doors open again, her floor, she steps out. And for a brief second, everything is still exactly the way it should be. The hallway stretches ahead, her apartment just a short walk away. No sign of anyone else. She takes a step forward, not loud, not sudden at first, just enough to break the stillness. From the direction of the stairwell, someone steps out. Before she can fully react, he's already closing the distance. It happens fast. Too fast. There's no time to process. No time to step back. No time to understand why he's there. The moment shifts instantly from routine to survival. He lunges at her. The force of it pushes her off balance. The hallway that felt safe just seconds ago becomes a confined space with nowhere to go. And in that moment, she sees him, recognizes him, not a stranger, not someone unfamiliar. "Stop, Luis." Her voice breaks through the silence, sharp and desperate. "Stop, Luis, stop." There's no confusion in her words, only realization. She knows exactly who is attacking her. And that changes everything. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't unexpected danger from someone unknown. This was someone who had been part of her life. Someone who knew her. Which raises a question that becomes impossible to ignore. Why would someone wait that long, unless they had already decided what they were going to do? The struggle continues. Fast, uncontrolled, overwhelming. There's no pause, no hesitation, just movement and resistance as she tries to pull away, to create space, to stop what's happening. But the attack doesn't slow down, it continues. Again and again. Her voice, still trying to break through. "Stop, Luis." Inside the apartment, just feet away, her children are asleep. Unaware of what's happening outside their door. Unaware that their mother is fighting for her life in the hallway. That separation, just a few feet of space, becomes one of the most difficult parts of this moment to process. Because everything is so close, and yet, completely out of reach. From another apartment down the hall, a neighbor hears something. A disturbance. Not clear words at first, just the sound of movement, something out of place in an otherwise quiet hour. They pause. Listen, trying to understand what they're hearing. But by the time it becomes clear that something is wrong, the moment is already unfolding too quickly to stop. Back in the hallway, Carmen's voice grows weaker. The attack doesn't last long, but it doesn't need to. Everything happens within moments, moments that change everything. And then, silence. The same hallway that was quiet when she stepped out of the elevator returns to that stillness again. But now, it's different. Leaving one question hanging in the air. What happened in those final seconds? After her voice faded. The hallway doesn't stay silent for long. At some point, someone steps out, a neighbor. A building porter making his rounds. Carmen is found there, collapsed just outside her apartment door. Unresponsive, injured. The scene immediately shifts from confusion to urgency. Calls are made. Voices that were absent just moments ago now fill the hallway. Doors open. People gather at a distance, trying to understand what they're seeing without getting too close. Emergency services arrive quickly. She's still alive when they reach her. Barely. They move fast, lifting her, stabilizing what they can, rushing her out of the building that had always been her safe place. Down the same elevator. through the same entrance. At the hospital, efforts continue. Doctors work to save her, but the injuries are too severe. Despite everything done, Carmen Lopez does not survive. And just like that, what began as a quiet early morning turns into a homicide investigation. From that moment forward, the focus shifts. Who did this? But in this case, that question doesn't take long to answer, because Carmen had already said his name. Luis. Law enforcement moves quickly. Officers begin searching for Luis Marquez almost immediately. This isn't a situation where they're starting from nothing. There's a clear direction, a clear person of interest, and not long after, they find him. He's located at a hospital in Bronx, not as a visitor, but as someone seeking treatment. He has injuries on his hands, cuts, signs of a struggle. Details that align too closely with what had just happened for it to be ignored. He's taken into custody. No long chase, no attempt to disappear, just a direct line from the scene to him. From a law enforcement perspective, the pieces fall into place quickly. A victim identified, a suspect named, physical evidence that supports what occurred, and a timeline that begins to form around one critical detail: time spent waiting. In court, the case is presented with clarity. The attack is described as deliberate, focused, not something that happened in a moment of confusion, but something that had direction behind it. The charges reflect that. Murder. And as more details come forward, one part of the case stands out more than anything else. Not just the violence of the attack, not just the fact that it happened outside her own door, but the time that came before it. Because Luis Marquez didn't just show up and react. He waited. Over 2 hours, inside the building, holding on to a decision long enough for it to settle. Long enough for it to become real. When people first hear about a case like this, the question comes almost immediately: why? Not just what happened, but what drives someone to wait for hours, and then act with that level of intensity? In this case, the answer doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from a pattern that had been building long before that night. At the center of it was jealousy. Not the casual kind that fades with reassurance, but something deeper, something tied to identity. Luis Marquez didn't just see Carmen Lopez as someone he loved. He saw her as someone he couldn't lose. And that distinction matters, because love allows distance, it allows change, it allows people to move on, even when it hurts. But when attachment turns into dependency, the rules change. The relationship becomes more than emotional, it becomes structural. A part of how someone sees themselves, how they function, how they feel grounded. And when that structure is removed, it doesn't feel like loss, it feels like collapse. Carmen had moved forward. She had created distance, she had ended the cycle. But Luis hadn't reached that same place. Instead, the separation created pressure. From an analytical perspective, situations like this often follow a similar progression. First, there's attachment, strong, sometimes overwhelming, but still within the boundaries of a relationship. Then comes instability, arguments, separation, emotional imbalance. And finally, if that attachment isn't released, it turns into fixation, a focus that narrows, a mindset that stops adapting. Instead of accepting the end of the relationship, the individual begins to reject it entirely. And when rejection meets emotional dependency, the result can become unpredictable. And when that belief is challenged, when reality doesn't match what the person is holding on to, it creates conflict. Not just with the other person, but within themselves. That internal conflict doesn't stay contained. It builds. It shifts. And eventually, it can move from thought to action. By the time Luis Marquez entered that building and waited in that stairwell, the emotional stage had already been set. This wasn't about a single argument. This wasn't about one moment. It was the result of something that had been forming over time. Jealousy that didn't fade, attachment that didn't loosen, and a need for control that didn't disappear when the relationship ended. Because in the end, the motive wasn't hidden. It was right there, beneath everything. A refusal to accept that someone had moved on, and a mindset that couldn't let go. One of the biggest warning signs is the difference between love and obsession. Love allows space. It allows growth. It accepts change, even when that change is painful. Obsession does the opposite. It holds on tighter when things begin to fall apart. It refuses to accept distance. It turns another person into something that must be kept, rather than someone who is free to choose. And sometimes that shift is hard to recognize while you're inside it, because it doesn't always start with fear. It can start with attention, with intensity, with someone wanting to be around you all the time. But over time, that intensity can become pressure, and pressure can become something else entirely. Another critical point in cases like this is what happens after a breakup. Most people assume that once a relationship ends, the risk disappears. But in reality, that's often when the situation becomes more serious. Because the structure of the relationship is gone, the access is gone. And for someone who is emotionally dependent, that loss can feel overwhelming. It's not just about missing the person. It's about losing control over something they believed was theirs. That's when behavior can change. That's when persistence turns into monitoring. But when patterns begin to form, when something feels off, when behavior becomes repetitive, when boundaries aren't respected, that's the moment to take it seriously. Because the longer something is ignored, the more it can build into something harder to stop. This case isn't just about what happened in one hallway. It's about everything that led up to it. The signs that were easy to overlook, the attachment that didn't release, the shift from connection to control. And it leaves questions that are worth thinking about. Have you ever ignored a red flag that later made sense? What would you have done in her situation? Because sometimes understanding these patterns isn't just about looking back. It's about recognizing them before they reach a point where there's no time left to react. It started like any other night. Carmen Lopez walked into her building just after 4 a.m., expecting nothing more than to make it back to her apartment, close the door, and rest. The hallway was quiet, familiar, safe. Just a few steps stood between her and the place she had built her life around. And then, in an instant, everything changed. No warning, no time to prepare, just a moment that divided everything into before and after. The idea that something so life-changing can exist so close to something so ordinary, that someone she once trusted could be the one waiting, that a space meant for safety could become the exact opposite in seconds. Somewhere between that elevator opening and the silence that followed, everything shifted. And while the moment itself was brief, the impact didn't end there. It carried into the lives of her children, into the people who knew her, into everyone left trying to understand how something like this happens. Somewhere between that quiet hallway and the silence that followed, the truth was already there. Waiting. Stories like this raise real questions. Do you think this could have been prevented? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, share this video so more people hear her story. And if you believe cases like this deserve justice, subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles.